This particular lesson, Yahweh judges the nations. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about where we hit last week. We started this lesson last week, chapter 25 to 32, 7-chapter section. And I did say last week this particular section of the class been kind of a time sinkhole for me. I've spent an awful lot of time and energy in it and been very fascinated by it. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. These years, 588 to 585, are very important years because during these years, Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to the city of Jerusalem in Judah. And so on the front end, during and after, it looks like what Ezekiel has been saying for about 7 years is going to happen. Now, in the next lesson, that will change the course of his ministry, because up to now he's been fighting an uphill battle against people, just as Jeremiah was doing back in Jerusalem, people who don't believe he knows what he's talking about. And I would say for each of the prophets, there comes a period in their career where something they say happens. And that's a very important part of the canonization of their writings, preservation over time. In these 7 chapters, the editor of the book, which may well be Ezekiel himself. A lot of times the books of the prophets look like other people over time have added to them, expanded them, organized them. But at any rate, he deals with 7 nations other than Israel, and Yahweh's dealings with them. Now, the 7 nations, we dealt with 3.5, 4 last week. Edom, Moab, Ammon, and Philistia, first 4. And then today we're going to get going on the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. For a total of, in Phoenicia, he divides it in 2. So you have the city of Tyre and its sister city, Sidon. So for a total of 7. The number 7 is used throughout the Bible all the way back from Genesis chapter 1 as a literary device for covering a whole sweep of a subject. Last week, I mentioned that one of the first things I observed about Ezekiel in the prophet Amos, when he judges the nations outside Israel, he does so because of their immorality, how they abuse and misuse their own people. So Amos is a very popular book for people who are interested in social causes. I mean, if you listen to any speech by Martin Luther King Jr., you're going to hear passages from the prophet Amos. Amos speaks, I was just, last year we were listening to I Have a Dream, which is a very famous speech, and it's just drenched with stuff from Amos and Isaiah, right out of the Bible. And, when I hear those passages, boy, I get all choked up because I'm thinking of the Old Testament and everything, so Martin Luther King Jr. is just wham, wham. There's different opinions about his role as a civil rights activist and everything, but that's what he draws on. Now, in Ezekiel, the nations are judged on the basis of how they respond to the fall of Jerusalem. And that's a different issue. It's not how they treat humanity in general. How do they respond to God's people, Israel, when Jerusalem falls? And that's characteristic of Ezekiel. We get a little bit of that in the Old Testament, like when Abraham travels to Canaan, it seems that the people who engage with him either have success or failure depending on how they respond to Abraham. You have that promise, whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. When Pharaoh takes Abram's wife into his harem, he runs into trouble. When Abraham goes by the trees of Mamre in Hebron and the Ammonites are friendly to him, they prosper. And so there's this idea that how people deal with Israel is an indirect indication of their relationship with Yahweh, the God of Israel. So you get a lot of that in Ezekiel. Now, I want to mention the three that we covered last week real quick and then move on to Philistia. Moab and Ammon, which are east of the land of Israel here, are the two nations descended from Lot's daughters. You might know the story in Genesis where Lot, after he escapes from Sodom and Gomorrah, his daughters produce offspring through him, and the Bible traces these nations to those two people. So they're kin. They're kin with the nation of Israel. So is Edom. Most of you know that the Edomites, in the Bible, their descent is traced to Esau, Jacob's brother. And then we come to Philistia today. Now, of these nations, Ammon and Moab disappear entirely from the historical record about this time. So they're fairly wiped out. And some of that has to do with the events after Ezekiel's time. Jeremiah contains a record of after Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem, the governor who he put in its place was assassinated. And a number of people got involved in the assassination attempt. And in response to that, Ammon and Moab were just wiped out. Nebuchadnezzar was done with that. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Philistia. Edom will carry on, and we'll come back to Edom a little bit later. And then after that, really what I want to focus on are the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. So I'm picking up on page 64 in the lesson. The Philistines, I'll just say a few words about them and see if there are any questions, are not native to the Levant, the land of Canaan. They appear about the 13th century BC, around the time of the Great Trojan War. You like Homer's Iliad? Whether you think Brad Pitt makes a good Achilles or not, I think he was terrible. He's not Achilles, sorry. He's good looking, though. Doug, you look concerned that Brad Pitt is not Achilles. But I know why they picked him for the role. And Orlando Bloom was in there before he played Legolas the Elf for Lord of the Rings. What did he play? He played Paris. Oh, for those of you who've seen the movie Troy, and there are no gods in that movie. That's the other thing. I watched the movie Troy about the Trojan War, and if you've read Homer's Iliad, the gods are like 9/10 of the book, and in the movie there are no deities. Like, well, how can you tell the story of Troy without the deities? There's got to be Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and the whole bit, but they didn't do it. What's that? Agamemnon? Yeah.
No, the guy who Achilles kills.
Oh, Patroclus. Yes. He's all right for that role. I received that. Yeah, he was okay to play Patroclus. That's okay. Yeah. And they had a guy play Hector. Hector. It was Hector. Well, that's okay. So Greece is up here, but in the 13th century, the Mycenaean Greeks began to migrate throughout the Mediterranean. We don't know all the reasons for that. Many of them hit the city of Troy. We have records in Egypt that they attacked the coast of Egypt. Several of them settled on the coast of Palestine, became known as the Philistines. But at any rate, they're not native, and so on page 64, I mention here they established 5 city-states. It's called a pentapolis, very Greek way of expressing it. Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, Gath, and Ashkelon. Now Gaza, that city-state, gave its name to this little strip of land where they settled. We still call it the Gaza Strip even today in the news. Right now, there's an organization called Hamas that's at war with Israel right on the Gaza Strip. So that hasn't changed. The Bible names Dagon as their Philistine god, though they worship a lot of the gods of the region. We have this oracle in chapter 25, 15 to 17. Thus says Adonai Yahweh, because the Philistines acted revengefully and took vengeance with malice of soul to destroy in never-ending enmity. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yahweh, behold, I will stretch out my hand against the Philistines. I will cut off the Kerethites. That is an old word that probably refers to, I haven't got it on my map here, but the island of Crete, which always remained in close connection with Greece, and destroy the rest of the sea coast. Vengeance on them with wrathful rebukes, and then they will know that I am Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, took over Philistia, destroyed its cities, either killing or exiling its inhabitants to Mesopotamia. And here, as with the Ammonites and the Moabites, their language, their culture disappears from the region fairly quickly. However, the Greeks and the Romans still preserve a memory of their having been there, and that's one of the reasons why we call the region Palestine. That name comes from Philistia and remains to the present day. It was put there by the Romans as an insult to the Jews. After the Jews were removed, they got rid of the name Israel, or Judea rather, I should say, called it Palestine. We still call it Palestine today. So those are the first four. I'll see if there's any questions, and then I want to move on to Phoenicia and Egypt, because those are Ezekiel's main concern. Yeah. Since the return of the Jews in 48, this region is known as Israel. But prior to their arrival, it was still called Palestine. And we talked a little bit about this in the Islam class. The so-called two-state solution was to carve out a state for Israel and one for Palestine. Now, Sister Sharon's here today, and I will remind all of you that the official statehood of Palestine is a hot topic, whether it meets the criteria of a state. That's a legitimate issue, and as many of you know, just in the last week, war in the region has risen to a new level with the involvement of Iran. And so we're not going to see the end of battle there for a long time. They still retain the name Palestine, though, as a kind of Islamic state created on behalf of the Muslims post-World War II. Whether it's a state, though, does it have a distinct people with their own culture and language, etc., trying to live? Or is this just a tract of land being used as a base of operations to wipe out Israel? That is the question, you know. And that would not be a state in the classical sense of the word. That's a bunker from which to lob grenades at your enemy. That's a little bit different, so. Okay. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had a plan here, and we'll go into this in some depth. Ancient Egypt, I mentioned last week, was by some accounts the oldest civilization in the world, and it is certainly the longest lasting. Almost 3,000 years. It also achieved what for ancient peoples was considered the ideal of a civilization. They lived in symbiosis with their natural environment, which for ancients would be the gods. But the Nile, the desert, everything came together for them. They were practically impregnable. Many peoples had tried to wage war against the Egyptians. It was very difficult. They had a perpetual water source, and they were surrounded by desert. So armies just broke upon the Egyptians like water against rock. And so Egypt was the crown jewel of these new civilizations. And I used this example last week. It was like Hitler wanting to conquer Stalingrad. It was a symbolic victory to defeat the Egyptians. Because technically speaking, part in Ezekiel refers to this, their strength was also their weakness. The Nile protected them, but it also prevented them from becoming the kind of dynamic civilization that could expand. They were tied to the land and their culture. They could never become like Mesopotamia or Persia or Greece, where they could stretch out, spread their culture. So Nebuchadnezzar wanted to conquer Egypt. And just to say he did it. And he practically conquered everything else in the Middle East. So once he'd conquered Egypt, he would have conquered what would have been called the cradle of civilization. And his idea was to get Tyre first, the city of Tyre, and to approach Egypt from the sea. So Ezekiel focuses on these as a main object. Top of page 65. Tyre has a deity named Melkart. The royal family of the king of Tyre claims to be descended from gods. Of course, that's what all ancient kings claimed. Her greatest claim to fame in literature was with Queen Dido, also known as Alyssa. If you've read Virgil's Aeneid, you know that when Aeneas escaped Troy and went looking for a new country, he landed at a city called Carthage. And the queen of the Carthaginians was Dido, and he had an affair with her. And the gods eventually came to Aeneas, so the story goes, and says, this is a really great thing you've got going here, but you have a duty to something bigger than you and your little fling with Dido. So he dumps her. That's the modern way of putting it. Hops on a ship, sails off the next day. Anybody know what Dido does? I tell the boys in class, be warned.
Women are crazy. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they love you one next moment, and they'll cut your throat the next if you're not careful. Because nothing turns to hate like love, right? Or I'd say no one hates each other with the hatred of people who once loved. It's a different kind of a hate. And so when he gets on the boat and sails off, she calls down a curse upon both of their offspring, Aeneas, the Romans, her offspring, the Carthaginians, and that becomes kind of the story of how Rome and Carthage became arch enemies with each other. And then she makes a big funeral pyre and kills herself and burns it, and the smoke goes up. Yeah, watch out. Don't have an affair with a Carthaginian princess. This is dangerous. Generations of people will suffer because of it. So she's the most famous person from Tyre, though we all know or have heard about the great city-state of Carthage. And through Canaan and Carthage, Tyre and then rather Carthage, Canaanite culture spreads and then touches Rome. Now, many of you know one of the great generals in the wars between Rome and Carthage was Hannibal. But Hannibal means the grace of Baal, Khan Baal. And so the Carthaginians were worshipers of Baal, just as the Phoenicians were, just as the Canaanites were. And the Greeks and the Romans also noted their predilection for child sacrifice. And so that was a feature of Canaanite culture that continued. And it went from Canaan to Phoenicia and it spread all the way to northeast Africa. So a little bit of background about the city-state of Tyre.
This may be getting in the weeds too much. But Baal was a regional god, yes?
Baal, yes. He was the god of storm.
Okay. It makes sense
Good question. Usually deities become important because of where they're at. So Baal is the god of storm is particularly important because of this agricultural society. Their whole livelihood depends on the rains. Egypt's also worshipped a god of storm, but he's not particularly important. Ra, the god of the sun, is the man. Probably then the Carthaginians continued their worship of Baal because of the memory of the tradition of their founders. They were a colony, kind of like America. They began as a colony, then they became an independent state, and then they preserved their tradition.
Baal worship also spread northward because the Ugarit
Even further north.
were also Baal worshippers. And largely because of the Ugarit library is how we really know how the mythology works, because we only had very little material until the discovery of the Ugarit library, which was hundreds and hundreds of cuneiform texts, many of them about the mythology itself, so we got a pretty good idea of what Baal worship was like.
Yeah, most of our knowledge of Baal comes from the Old Testament. In the early 20th century, we discovered a library of texts written in cuneiform that contain myths of the god Baal. I took a very heavily attended class at Brandeis called Ugaritic.
Oh, yeah.
Heavily attended. There were about 6 of us there, and we went through the grammar. Cyrus Gordon wrote the grammar for that. You might know him, and we read some of those texts. Riveting. In the early spring of 586, just a few months before the fall of Jerusalem, Ezekiel delivers the first in a series of oracles against Tyre. And Tyre, again, is sort of what eventually Carthage would become, the queen of the Mediterranean Sea. After the fall of Tyre, the business passes to the Carthaginians. After Rome defeats Carthage, it passes to the Romans, and it enables the Romans to conquer pretty much the whole Mediterranean world. The initial occasion of these oracles, page 65, was Tyre's taunt that their commercial rival, the city of Jerusalem, was about to be no more than a trading route, and that a trading route from north to south was now open. In the 11th year, Ezekiel writes, the first day of the month, the word of Yahweh came to me, Son of man, because Tyre said concerning Jerusalem, Aha, the gate of the peoples is broken. It is swung open to me. I shall be filled now that she has been ruined. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yahweh, behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves. So, typical. Now, Ezekiel predicts that Nebuchadnezzar will destroy and plunder Tyre completely. This passage, chapter 26, verses 7 to 14, and this is an important passage because Nebuchadnezzar does lay siege to Tyre, but he doesn't quite conquer it the way Ezekiel says here. I will bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a host of many soldiers. With the hooves of his horses he will trample all your streets. He will kill your people with the sword. Your mighty pillars will fall to the ground. They will plunder your riches, loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls, destroy your pleasant houses. Your stones and timber and soil they will cast into the midst of the waters. And I will stop the music of your songs. The sound of your lyres shall be heard no more. I will make you a bare rock. You will be a place for the spreading of nets. You shall never be rebuilt. For I am Yahweh, I have spoken, declares Adonai. And then Ezekiel concludes with his 2 of these, one for Tyre and one for Egypt, a description of Tyre going down to Hades, to the netherworld, or to hell. Now, not hell in the Dante sense as a place of punishment, but where the dead go. Thus says Adonai Yahweh to Tyre, will not the coastlands, top of page 66, shake at the sound of your fall, when the wounded groan, when slaughter is made in your midst? For thus says Adonai Yahweh, when I make you a city laid waste, like the cities that are not inhabited, when I bring up, here's a tricky word to translate, Tehom. Usually in your Bibles, Tehom is a Hebrew word translated the deep. We don't really know how to translate it. It's very close to Babylonian Tiamat, Tehom, and it refers to the primeval sea from which all things came into being. So it's a word weighted with mythic tones. And I draw attention to it here because from here to the end of the book, Ezekiel takes on a more and more mythic idiom of writing. He uses words and images that are mythic or apocalyptic. Certainly when we get into Gog and Magog and the building of a third temple, the building of a new temple, his language conjures this up. The great waters will cover you. I will make you go down with those who go down to the pit, to an ancient people. I will make you dwell in the nether regions, among ancient ruins, with those who go down to the pit, so that you will not be inhabited. But I will make glory in the land of the living. I will bring you to a dreadful end, and you shall be no more. Though you be sought for, you will never be found again, declares Adonai Yahweh. So Tyre is going to be laid to siege. Tyre is going to be wiped out. Tyre is going to go down to the netherworld. And now Ezekiel gets into that mythic idiom I was talking about before. And I should probably say a word about the word mythic. In America, we use the word myth to refer to stories that are not true. Scholars don't usually use the word that way. I don't use the word that way. But that's how the word is often used. Ancient literature often is considered mythic, not to say that the story is not true. Here you got to kind of put your C.S. Lewis hat on. Some of you like Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis always liked to describe Christianity as true myth. And obviously he was a Christian, so he didn't mean by that Christianity wasn't true. But what he meant by that is that Christianity is a story about eternal things in rich symbolic language, and that it's also true. And he embeds that in his Chronicles of Narnia. So, did Aslan die on the stone table to rescue Edmund? If you know The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Yes. If by Aslan you mean Christ, and if by the stone table you mean the cross, and if by Edmund you mean fallen man. It's a true story. It doesn't mean Edmund is a real historic figure, but it does mean that the story has a basis in truth. And Ezekiel, I point that out because Ezekiel in this section, from this to the end of the book, is going to talk in an increasingly mythic idiom. And people who like to nail down verses and words in the Bible to a very specific historic referent are going to run into some trouble. The same way they would if they tried to do that with other kinds of literature. And so let me see if there's any questions about that. That's sort of a prelude, because we're going into an area of Ezekiel where he does a little bit different than what he's been doing up to this point in the book.
You're talking about mythical in grandiose language, or it's in allegorical language? I missed it.
No, that's a good question. I'll see if this answers it. Usually what Ezekiel has to say refers to two things or more. One, in the immediate historic context in which he's living, but he tells it in a way to have resonances or echoes that stretch beyond the immediate historical. Kind of like Psalm 2 has a little bit of mythic resonance to it. In Psalm 2, Yahweh says to his Messiah, which would appear to be King David, I will give you the nations as your inheritance. Now, literally speaking, David did not conquer the world. But most Christians, and we recite that psalm often enough in the liturgy, understand that as an early echo of Christ, God's Messiah through the line of David. And so Psalm 2 kind of has an immediate reference. David is talking about his military exploits, among which are some of the nations we've been discussing. He's conquered them. But we still read Psalm 2, and a lot of times when we read it in view of a larger picture than maybe the one that the writer of Psalm 2 originally had in mind. Some scholars call that dual fulfillment. We get that with the Isaiah passage. The young woman or the virgin will be with child refers to an event in Isaiah's own time during the reign of King Ahaz. But almost inevitably, we'll read it at Christmas time as a reference to Jesus of Nazareth. And there's a lot of passages like that in Ezekiel that have a kind of immediate historical context, but he tells it in such a way that it looks to some as yet undefined future. Yeah.
Would that have been understood to the listeners at the time? Would that idea come after Christ?
What I'll say is, that's a good question. What would the original readers have understood by it? It's evident that as within a few centuries, the book of Ezekiel has already been canonized, included in the Jewish scriptures, and it's been heavily used in the book of Daniel, and the Jews are already looking to it for illumination about the messianic future. So it's not just a post-Christian phenomenon. That's a good question.
Necessarily the time that it was happening now.
But probably not in Ezekiel's own time. Yeah. But certainly after Ezekiel had died, the book had become canonical. It was not untypical for the Jewish people, at least, to find in Ezekiel a glimpse into their future. So it's not just a sort of Christian apologetic. We think these passages are about Christ, and we've kicked the explanation back to Ezekiel. The Jews themselves worked with the text this way. And a lot of Ezekiel we've seen in this class shows up in Revelation and Daniel quite a bit. So that's a good question. Any other questions or thoughts about that?
We do somewhat the same sort of thing. We talk about the ship of state, for instance, as the sort of using the idea of a ship as a way of talking about America.
Mm-hmm.
And someone says, well, is it true? Well, yes, but being true doesn't necessarily mean it should be read like a newspaper account of an incident on Third Avenue. It is true, but it's true in a more artistic kind of way rather than a flat and literal kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And at least in my experience, I found that there are some Christians that can't read anything artistically. It's just not in their capacity. And I find that frustrating because quite a lot of literature in the Bible is written that way. So they want to read it in a different way, and I find that to be well, frustrating and sometimes even annoying.
Well, I'm with you there. I got to be careful here because I like literature, and I like the arts, and I like the fact that one word can have a wide range of different resonances of meaning. But you're right, some people don't have an ear for it. And I'd like to say with Jesus to his disciples, are you so dull? But that's not the nicest way to put it, but that's... you have those passages in the New Testament where Jesus is telling parables, and the disciples are a bunch of Dr. Watsons. They can't figure out what it is that he's talking about. Or what does he say in the boat? I have bread that you know nothing about. And the disciples are like, well, he's upset because we didn't bring any food. Like, oh boy, this is what we have to work with here. But I encounter that too, when Jesus is on his way to the temple. He curses the fig tree. The fig tree withers. Famous, famous story. And I can't count the number of people in Bible classes that are like, what is that about? You just walk around and curse trees and they wither? And of course, the tree, going back to early ancient Israelite imagery, is a symbol for the people of Israel, for the temple, for the nation of Israel. So it's a highly significant event, and it's always told on the front end of Jesus clearing the temple. So that's not an accident either. But we are sort of trained within this hyper-literalism, and so when we encounter these passages, we have difficulty catching the symbolism. And I'll say one other word about it, see if there's questions, and jump back into this. I think that's a Protestant reaction to early Catholic interpretation, which was so symbolic that it kind of went overboard. You get a lot of that of Origen of Alexandria, where he seems to find in every word, every sentence, every passage, some sort of symbol. And after a while, you feel like, well, he's seeing faces in the clouds. They're not really there. And so Protestants sort of react on the other end and say, well, it's all literal. There's no figures of speech. And of course, the truth is more complicated than either of those views. So I just think that's a tendency that we have.
I missed part of your phrase for the scholars talking about the immediate and future.
Yeah. Dual fulfillment, it's sometimes called. Dual fulfillment. The Isaiah passage with the young virgin is a perfect example of that, classic example of that.
A really good example of dual fulfillment is the prophet Nathan telling David, you will have a son who will build your house. Well, who was that? Well, Solomon, but Solomon doesn't exhaust the long reach of that idea. Because he goes on to say, the son that will build me a house will reign forever. Solomon certainly didn't do that. So you have to realize that in some of those kinds of things, there's a sort of a near perspective, and then there's a longer perspective.
Yeah. And that, for me, when I was at the Jewish university, is the basis of a kind of ongoing argument between Jews and Christians. Like, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew likes to quote Old Testament passages and say, see, this fulfills what the prophet had said. And a standard Jewish response would be, well, that's not what the prophet was talking about. So they'll go back to the immediate fulfillment. And they'll say, you Christians, you got all giddy with these prophecies. You got too excited. They weren't talking about that at all. They were talking about this event. And so I would say they're right, actually. That is what the prophet was talking about. But I think not only Christians, but even the Jews themselves regarded these prophecies as having two fulfillments, one in the immediate context and one in the remote future. Okay, so I did want to spend some time on that, and I've probably overtalked it, but on page 66, Ezekiel's been talking about the city of Tyre And now he switches into a rather more mythic idiom, is what I call it. So he moves on to its ruler and delivers an oracle against King Ethbaal III. He would be the historic ruler of Tyre city at the time. He's considered to be divine. He's not reluctant about accepting his divinity, which is true to form. Any politician today, if we said that they were a god, I'm sure that they would be happy to say, you are correct.
How did you know?
Far be it from me to say no to that. The word of Yahweh came to me, Son of man, say to the prince of Tyre, thus says Adonai Yahweh, because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am a god. I sit on the seat of gods in the heart of the seas, yet you are but a man and no God, though you hold your heart to be like that of a god. Surely you are wiser than Daniel. Surely no secret is hidden from you. By your wisdom and your understanding, you have got wealth for yourself. You've gathered gold and silver into your treasuries. By your great wisdom in your trade, you have made your wealth great, and your heart has become proud in your wealth. So, condemned the king of Tyre and said, you're proud and you're going to be brought low. Because you hold your heart like to be the heart of a god, I will bring foreigners upon you, the most ruthless of the nations, and they shall draw their swords against the beauty of your wisdom and defile your splendor. They shall thrust you down into the pit. You shall die the death of the slain in the heart of the seas. Will you still say, I am a god in the presence of those who kill you? That's a good question. Will you say, I am a god when they kill you? Probably not. And when you prove to be a man and no God in the hands of those who slay you, you shall die the death of the uncircumcised by the hands of foreigners. For I have spoken, declares Adonai Yahweh. However, on footnote, they're adding up, 119, Ezekiel adds this about the king of Tyre, and it doesn't sound like he's talking about Ethbaal III anymore. This is a very famous passage. The word of Yahweh came to me, Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, you are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Now right there you stop and say, whoa, are we talking about the king of Tyre? Ethbaal III was in Eden, the model of perfection amongst the precious stones. You were anointed a cherub, a guardian cherub. Okay? Most of us would say, Ezekiel, you lost me. I placed you. You are on the holy mountain of God. Really? In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways in the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, okay, that sounds like Ethbaal III. You were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. By the multitude of your iniquities and the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned the sanctuaries. So I brought fire out from your midst. It consumed you. I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. All who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever. All right, now that's a famous passage in Ezekiel where he goes from a historical idiom, Ethbaal III is going to get wiped out by Nebuchadnezzar. Now most of us can grasp that. But then he starts talking about the king of Tyre as being Eden, as being on the mountain of God, as being a cherub, as having fallen, and then being destroyed. And for most of us at that point, we're like, whoa, what just happened? And I won't say I can solve. This passage has been interpreted and interpreted and interpreted. It's been given dozens of different interpretations. So I've got my own, and I've got it in the footnote there. because that's what any honest person will do. But he has moved to what I call a mythic idiom. He's taken the king of Tyre and used him as an archetype for something larger than life. And now he's talking partially about the king of Tyre and talking about something bigger than the king of Tyre. A lot of ancient writers do this. They love it. I like it. Try to think of a good example. We've mentioned a few kind of archetypal stories. But you know, it's easy to come up with examples that are less complicated than the biblical ones. That's the tricky part of it.
What about the first couple of verses of John where it's talking about man was like the light of man and all that?
Well, that's not bad. If you say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word, it's not immediately obvious that the Word is Christ till you read into the passage. In him was life, and that life was the light of the world. Christ is, in John actually says, the life that gives light to every man. He's speaking of Jesus Christ as though he is the spiritual illumination of all human beings throughout all of time and history everywhere. That's an odd idea. That takes some meditation, because that we wouldn't dawn on that. That's not a bad example. John loves, both in the gospel and in the letters, the metaphor of light. In the letter of 1 John, it says, God is light.
Yes.
That's a powerful passage. I think John's one of your favorites. Is that right?
Yes.
I knew that. Okay. And it can't just be literal. It's a figure of speech. God is light in a profound sense of the word. So I'll say a few words about this, see if there's any questions, because it'll be relevant when we go into other passages. This is a safe thing to say in a footnote. The interpretation of this oracle is much discussed. So anytime a pastor or a teacher says that, it means don't press me on this. I say he's the archetypally proud king, the king who is proud. He's first described as a human being in the garden, but then as a cherub on the mountain of God. So those are two very, very different things. Some people have found in this passage a reference to the fall of Satan. Now, it may have dawned on you that in the whole Old Testament, there's really no explicit account of the devil rebelling and being kicked out of heaven, such as you find in Milton's Paradise Lost. Though I will say with a lot of students, they're surprised to find that out. They say, well, I thought that was in the Bible. And I will say, well, whether it's true or whether it's not true, it's not in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. Though sometimes this passage is seized upon as a reference to that, and certainly it's psychologically appropriate because it has to do with pride. And a being who is perfect and beautiful, God rejects because of its pride. I say here, since man and cherub appear to be identified, what we have here is probably a concession to the ancient idea that the first man was a king, that the kings were divine representatives of God himself. And Eden is sometimes conceived of as being on a mountaintop. A lot of times we think it's in lower Mesopotamia, but if you read the early chapters, it's evident that a river flows out from Eden, not to Eden, the headstreams of which would be in the mountainous territory, top of the Tigris and Euphrates, not at the bottom. And I think there's a good argument that that's why Noah's Ark is said to have landed on the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month, because they're connecting the Ark of story with the Eden story. But the ancient idea is that not of just a garden on a ground level, but that of a mountain, the plateau, and a garden at a raised level at the source of the waters that flow down. So whoever's hunting around for the Garden of Eden, I'd say probably up here rather than down there. As Indiana Jones once said, they're digging in the wrong place. That's about all I have time for today. Sidon will go quick, and then next week we'll do next week at the picnic we'll do Egypt and then follow up. But I want to stop for just a couple minutes and see if there's any questions or comments about that. I don't think this passage in Ezekiel is really about the fall of Satan from heaven. It's taking the king of Tyre as an archetype of the proud, fallen king. Yeah.
Does the Revelation say something about the fall of Satan?
It could. You have the story of the dragon, which is clearly the power of evil. And the dragon and his angels are thrown out of heaven after a war with Michael the archangel. The main issue is, well, what is the war with Michael and the archangel that causes Satan to be cast down from heaven? Is it sort of something before creation? But a lot of people will argue that it's actually Christ's victory over sin and death that's being referred to. You have some resonance with that in the Gospels where Jesus says to his disciples, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. He says that after the beginning of his ministry of casting out demons. So some people would go that route with it. So Revelation is a possibility. But then in Revelation you have these images that people take to mean different things. The woman who's about to give birth to the child, most Protestants are going to identify with the nation of Israel. Catholics will say it's the Virgin Mary. You could be either. It's a woman.
Surely it's America.
Or maybe it's America and the child is, Donald Trump? No. Lord, help us. No, I think God can do better than that. That's okay.
So you think this passage, talking about dual fulfillment, doesn't necessarily have a future aspect to it, just the present and the past aspect?
Well, it certainly has a present aspect, being the king of Tyre. It almost has an eternal kind of aspect. The casting down of the proud and of the kings of men. And by that extent, you could say all human rule and government. Now, if that's the case, then it almost is apocalyptic, and it almost serves as a prelude to the Messianic age, when God's own representative, perfect king, will rule in the place of earthly kings. So that's a good question. You say, oh, dual fulfillment. Great, but what's the second fulfillment? What are we looking at here? So those are some suggestions, but I want to leave it open-ended because I don't want to suggest for a moment that these difficult passages in Ezekiel are something about which we can talk about the scholarly consensus. There is no scholarly consensus. There's opinions, some of which are educated and some of which are not. That's a good question. All right, I'll let you go. Thank you.